Hello, I'm Kayla. Here's my name, and today is 11/10/2024. And I apologize if it looks a little dark in here. My ceiling light does not work, unfortunately, so all I have is this little desk light. And today I'll be giving my short presentation on a few words and their definitions. And I also have examples of them, and it is front to back. For the first word that I would like to define is disease, and I defined it as any illness or sickness that disrupts normal functions of the body. So an example that I used was influenza. It's that time of year where we're all getting our flu shots, hopefully, and we are trying to protect ourselves from getting the flu. Personally, I've had the flu and I've had COVID. I think I'd rather have COVID, because with the flu I felt like I was dying, I was sick, I felt like I couldn't move, I felt just so weak, couldn't eat, and I felt like I was just going to pass away at any moment. But I was in middle school, so it's been a long time since I had the flu, thank goodness. Alright, next is disease classification. So I define it as diseases that are put into specific groups to properly identify them. And examples of that would include the etiology, morphology, signs and symptoms that appear in a person, and also physiology. Etiology is the cause of the disease or illness. It explains the why the disease occurred or happened. So an example that I use for that is malaria. We all know, well, hopefully, that we know that mosquitoes transmit malaria, and in African countries, mosquitoes are very prevalent, and a lot of individuals might come up with having malaria because of mosquitoes transmitting the virus. Next is pathogenesis, and explains how a disease progresses. So for an example, day one of having a cold, you might have a scratchy throat, you might feel a little bit feverish, more fatigued than usual, but nothing too crazy. And between days 2 to 5, your throat starts to hurt, you start to have a fever, you have a runny nose, you have headaches, and then by the last few days, between 6 and 7 days, you start to feel a little bit better. Your nose isn't running as much, your throat doesn't feel like it's burning, you start to feel better overall. So with a cold, there are the onset of symptoms, in the middle of the sickness, and then the end of the sickness. Next, we have symptoms, which is the indication of an illness. So an example that I put down is nausea. So it's not normal for a person to feel nauseous, and that usually says, okay, maybe this person isn't feeling well, but let's find out the why. You can be nauseous for a number of reasons. You could have, again, the flu. You could have COVID. You could have food poisoning. There's so many different ways that you can contract nausea, but that is just an example of a symptom. Next, we have signs, which is the illness is being expressed in that person. An example of a sign is a rash. So let's say you're out in the woods and you come across some poison ivy. More than likely you're going to get a very itchy rash or some sort. And also, babies, we know, get diaper rash all the time, and that's an indication of an illness, and they would usually have to receive medication for that. Alright. Next word is a syndrome, and it's a set of symptoms that occur together. So, example that we all heard of, Down syndrome. And some characteristics that someone with Down syndrome has are slanted eyes, flat face, short fingers, a small head, and usually they have mental delays as well. Next, we have diagnosis, which is an identification of the cause of an illness. An example, as a physician, you would look at that person's family history, you would do a physical exam, you might do lab work. Really, it's just to help us understand and find a way to treat that illness. Next, we have a complication, and that is when a disease or illness suddenly gets worse. And an example of this would be diabetes. There are millions of people who are suffering from diabetes, and a lot of them do receive treatment and are okay with their disease. And then there are those who don't necessarily take care of themselves properly, and then They start to notice that they're getting ulcers on their feet, or they're not seeing as well as they used to, which it's very common for a person with diabetes to have blindness and also infections in the feet, and usually they end up losing that foot and or leg because of it. Next, we have prognosis, which is a prediction of how a disease will progress, possible treatments, and the results. So, an example that I use is a broken arm. Usually when someone has a broken arm, they have to wear a cast up to 6 weeks, if not longer, depending on the severity of the break. And then that's just a projection of how long that person will have to wear the cast. And then once the cast is taken off, the doctor will examine how well the bone has healed itself. And then from there, if the bone is still healing, then that person might have to continue wearing a cast or do some other type of treatment. And if not, the bone is fine, it's stable, then that's the end of the treatment. Next, we have diagnostic tests, and that's a procedure to help identify a disease. So for an example, biopsy. I work in a hospital. We have to do a lot of lab work. We have to do a lot of biopsies. And when I had a keloid on my ear, she actually had to take a biopsy of that. And that was just to make sure that I wasn't growing any cancer cells or anything. But it doesn't necessarily always have to be a biopsy. It can just be simple, a urine test or blood work. But anyway, thank you, and that's the end of my presentation.